Ambassador Quibbleton adjusted his ceremonial sash for the third time in 10 minutes, a nervous habit he'd developed over his 200-year diplomatic career. As the Galactic Empire's senior cultural liaison, he prided himself on maintaining what historians would later call the most spectacular period of willful ignorance in recorded history. You see, the Galactic Empire had achieved something truly remarkable: 3,000 years of uninterrupted peace. Not through superior wisdom or enlightened governance, mind you, but through the simple expedient of pretending certain problems didn't exist. It was bureaucracy as an art form, really. The key to galactic harmony, Quibbleton often explained to junior diplomats, is proper categorization. File everything correctly, and peace maintains itself. And humanity? Well, humanity had been filed under quaint indigenous species, minimal oversight required. This classification had worked beautifully for centuries. While the Empire's 14 core species debated the proper font size for trade agreements and held committee meetings about forming committees, humans had been quietly doing human things in their little corner of the galaxy. Charming, really. Like watching children play with blocks. The Empire's xenobiologists had filed their reports with characteristic thoroughness. Humans display typical primitive behaviors: resource acquisition, territorial expansion, and an inexplicable fondness for explosive devices. Recommend continued minimal contact policy. What those reports failed to mention, mostly because nobody had bothered to look too closely, was the scale of this primitive behavior. While the Empire spent decades debating whether to upgrade their starport parking meters from hourly to daily rates, humans had casually colonized roughly 300 worlds. They're so refreshingly uncomplicated, Quibbleton had noted in his annual report. No tedious diplomatic protocols, no demands for Senate representation. They just do their own thing. The Empire found this delightfully low maintenance. Other species required constant attention, trade negotiations, cultural exchanges, formal complaints about noise ordinances. Humans sent a polite "hello, we're your neighbors now" message whenever they settled a new world, then went about their business with admirable independence. Marvelously self-sufficient, the Emperor had declared. We should encourage this sort of initiative in our other client species. The irony, which would become apparent much later, was that the Empire had created the perfect conditions for humanity to become exactly what the galaxy didn't need them to become. Left to their own devices, humans had developed a remarkably efficient approach to civilization: identify problem, solve problem, move on to next problem. No committees required. While the Empire's military held lengthy strategic planning sessions about theoretical threats that might possibly emerge in the next century, humans had built what they called a modest defensive capability. The Empire's intelligence services, such as they were, had filed this under local peacekeeping forces status, adequate for regional needs. The reality was somewhat different. Humans had looked at the galaxy's various dangerous neighborhoods and reached a characteristically human conclusion. If something was going to go wrong, it was probably going to go very wrong, very quickly. Best to be prepared. So they prepared. Quietly, efficiently, and with the sort of thoroughness that only comes from a species that had spent thousands of years practicing warfare on themselves before taking the show on the road. But the Empire didn't know any of this, because the Empire had a strict policy of not looking too hard at things that weren't actively on fire. It was a system that had worked beautifully for 3 millennia. Right up until it didn't. The beauty of our approach, Quibbleton had written in what would be his final routine report on human affairs, is that some species simply don't require active management. Humans fall beautifully into this category. Peaceful, predictable, and pleasantly irrelevant to broader galactic affairs. He submitted that report on a Tuesday. By Friday, the Empire discovered just how spectacularly wrong it was possible to be about one's neighbors. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Emperor Bloviatus, he the magnificently stupid, had earned his title through a combination of inherited authority and an almost supernatural ability to make the worst possible decision in any given situation. On the morning that would later be remembered as the day the galaxy got stupid, he was feeling particularly inspired. General Snootworth, the Emperor announced, settling his considerable bulk into the golden throne that had been specifically reinforced to handle his magnificence. I've been thinking. General Snootworth, a career military officer who had survived 40 years of imperial service by perfecting the art of enthusiastic agreement, immediately felt a familiar chill of dread. In his experience, nothing good ever followed those particular words from his emperor. Sire, your thoughts are always illuminating. Precisely, Bloviatus beamed. I've been reviewing our cultural preservation programs and I've noticed a glaring oversight. Our imperial zoo of galactic wonders lacks proper representation from some of our more rustic client species. The general consulted his datapad, hoping against hope that this conversation was heading somewhere sensible. Which species did you have in mind, Your Magnificence? Humans, obviously. The Emperor waved a jeweled hand dismissively. Charming little creatures, but we have virtually no specimens for proper study. How can we claim to be preserving galactic culture if we ignore entire species? Snootworth blinked slowly. In his military career, he developed a finely tuned instinct for danger, and every alarm in his head was currently screaming. Specimens, sire. Educational displays, General. Nothing crude, mind you. We're not barbarians. Bloviatus chuckled at his own wit. Simply a few representatives for our xenobiology programs. Perhaps some of their young children adapt so much better to new environments. You want to collect human children for the Imperial Zoo? Educational Center. The Emperor corrected with wounded dignity. We're scientists, not kidnappers. Think of it as a cultural exchange program. They provide specimens, we provide, well, the honor of contributing to imperial science. General Snootworth had reached that point in his career where retirement was looking increasingly attractive. Sire, perhaps we should consult with the diplomatic corps first. Ambassador Quibbleton has extensive files on human customs bureaucracy. Bloviatus waved dismissively. We've been talking these things to death for centuries. Sometimes, General, leadership requires decisive action. Besides, what could possibly go wrong? They're basically space monkeys. The general opened his mouth to object, then closed it again. 40 years of service had taught him to recognize when the Emperor had made up his mind. And besides, what was the worst that could happen? Humans were filed under minimal oversight required for a reason. How many specimens were you thinking, Your Magnificence? Oh, not many. A classroom's worth perhaps. 50 or 60 should provide adequate genetic diversity for our studies. And so, with the casual indifference of a man ordering lunch, Emperor Bloviatus the Magnificently Stupid signed the order that would end 3,000 years of galactic peace. The operation itself went exactly as planned, which should have been their first warning that something was terribly wrong. Imperial forces arrived at New Brooklyn, a pleasantly unremarkable human colony world, on what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. The local human authorities received a formal notification of Educational Specimen Collection Imperial Decree 457B, and were informed that resistance would be noted in their permanent files. The humans read the notice, looked at each other, and did absolutely nothing to stop them. 53 children from a primary school field trip were loaded onto Imperial transport ships with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that the Empire prided itself on. The human adults watched silently as their children were taken away, which the Imperial forces interpreted as appropriate deference to Imperial authority. What they didn't recognize was the expression on those human faces. If they had bothered to study human behavioral patterns beyond quaint and primitive, they might have noticed that humans tend to go very, very quiet when they're making very, very serious decisions. But the Empire had never bothered to learn what human silence actually meant. The transport ships departed New Brooklyn on schedule, carrying their precious cargo toward the Imperial capital. Mission accomplished, reports filed, bureaucracy satisfied. Behind them, New Brooklyn's communication arrays went dark. Then the neighboring systems went dark. Then entire sectors of human space simply stopped talking. General Snootworth noticed this first, because he was paid to notice things like ominous silence from entire regions of space. But when he brought it to the Emperor's attention, Bloviatus simply nodded approvingly. Excellent. They're probably organizing some sort of ceremonial farewell. Very respectful of them to observe proper mourning protocols. The general stared at his emperor and realized that perhaps 40 years of service hadn't been quite long enough to fully appreciate the depths of imperial stupidity. Sire, he said carefully, in my experience, when an entire species goes silent all at once, it's usually not because they're planning a ceremony. Nonsense, General. What else could they possibly be doing? What humanity was doing, as it turned out, was having the kind of conversation that entire civilizations remember for millennia afterward. The emergency session of the Human Colonial Defense Council lasted exactly 14 minutes, which was 13 minutes longer than it needed to. The first minute was spent confirming the facts. 53 children, ages 7 to 12, had been taken by the Galactic Empire for what their official documentation cheerfully described as educational specimen collection. The second minute was spent in the kind of absolute silence that usually precedes either enlightenment or apocalypse. The remaining 12 minutes were spent on formalities, because even in moments of species-defining rage, humans maintained their paperwork. Motion to classify this as an act of war. said Colonial Administrator Williams, her voice carrying the sort of calm that comes from being so angry that emotion has wrapped around to perfect clarity. Seconded came from every other representative simultaneously. All in favor, unanimous. Motion to authorize unlimited military response. Seconded, all in favor, also unanimous. Motion to designate Captain Morrison as Supreme Military Commander with full discretionary authority. This one took slightly longer, about 3 seconds, before another unanimous vote. And that was how Captain Brick Morrison, a man whose diplomatic philosophy could be summarized as speak softly and carry a really big stick, became the most dangerous person in the galaxy. Morrison had been enjoying a well-deserved shore leave on Terra Nova when his communicator started screaming with priority alerts. He'd been fishing, actually. A hobby that had taught him patience, precision, and the value of knowing exactly when to set the hook. "Sir," his aide stammered, when Morrison answered the emergency channel, "we have a situation." Morrison listened to the briefing in complete silence, his expression unchanging as he absorbed details about Imperial specimen collection programs and educational zoo exhibits. When the aide finished, Morrison set down his fishing rod with deliberate care. "Did you say they took children?" His voice was conversational, almost mild. "Yes, sir, 53 of them from New Brooklyn Primary School." Morrison nodded slowly, "And the Empire considers this educational." "According to their documentation, yes, sir." "I see." Morrison stood up, brushing dirt from his uniform. "Cancel my leave. Activate Protocol 7 across all human space." His aide went pale. Protocol 7 hadn't been used since the Centauri uprising, and that had been against pirates, not a galactic empire. "Sir, are you certain? Protocol 7 means, I know exactly what it means." Morrison's tone remained perfectly level, which somehow made it more terrifying than shouting would have been. "It means we stop pretending to be harmless." Within 6 hours, every human military installation in known space received the same message: Condition 7 Turgeon, taken authorization unlimited Morrison. The response was immediate and comprehensive. Human fleets that the Empire didn't know existed began emerging from bases the Empire had never detected. Ships that had been disguised as civilian transports suddenly sprouted weapon systems that violated several galactic treaties. Mining colonies revealed themselves to be forward military outposts, complete with defensive systems that made Imperial fortresses look like children's toys. Ambassador Quibbleton, monitoring communication channels from his comfortable office on the Imperial capital, noticed the sudden cessation of human chatter first. For 3 days, human space had been silent. Then, on the 4th day, every human communication array in the galaxy broadcast the same message simultaneously. To the Galactic Empire, "You have taken our children. You have 24 hours to return them unharmed to New Brooklyn, along with a formal apology and reparations to be negotiated. Failure to comply will result in consequences that will make your history books very interesting reading. This is your only warning. Captain Morrison, Supreme Commander, Human Colonial Defense Forces." The message was broadcast in 17 languages, including several that the Empire hadn't realized humans could speak. It was polite, professionally formatted, and absolutely terrifying in its restraint. Quibbleton immediately contacted his counterparts across the Empire, expecting to find them as puzzled as he was. Instead, he discovered that every major Imperial world had suddenly acquired what appeared to be new moons, except these moons hadn't been there yesterday, and they were broadcasting distinctly artificial energy signatures. "Their ships," reported Admiral Flabengast, the Empire's chief of naval operations, his voice cracking slightly. "Enormous ships. We count at least 200 capital-class vessels, and they appeared simultaneously across 47 Imperial systems." "That's impossible," Quibbleton protested. "Our intelligence reports classify human military capability as adequate for local defense at best." "Our intelligence reports," the Admiral replied grimly, "appear to have been somewhat optimistic." Meanwhile, Captain Morrison had established his command center aboard the HMS Righteous Indignation, a vessel that the Empire's ship classification systems couldn't even properly categorize. It was either a very large battleship or a very small mobile space station, and it carried enough firepower to sterilize small continents. "Status report," Morrison requested as he reviewed tactical displays that showed the positions of every Imperial fleet in known space. "All human assets are in position and ready," reported Commander Santos, his chief of staff. "The Empire has 47 major worlds, 19 military installations, and approximately 3,000 civilian targets within range of our guns. Civilian casualties. We've run the projections. If we limit ourselves to military and government targets, we can cripple their entire infrastructure, while keeping civilian losses to essentially zero." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Excellent. I want them to understand that we're not monsters, we're just very, very thorough when someone threatens our children. The irony was not lost on him that humanity's restraint was probably more terrifying than wanton destruction would have been. Any species could be randomly violent. It took a special kind of civilization to plan, coordinate, and execute military operations across an entire galaxy while specifically avoiding unnecessary casualties. Sir, his communications officer reported, we're receiving responses from several Imperial worlds. Most are demanding to know who we are and what we want. Morrison smiled, and it wasn't a particularly comforting expression. Tell them we're the people they should have gotten to know better before they decided to kidnap our children. And patch me through to Emperor Bloviatus directly. I think it's time we had a conversation. The 24-hour deadline came and went like a death sentence. Nobody wanted to read aloud. Emperor Bloviatus had spent those precious hours consulting with his advisors, who had spent them consulting with their subordinates, who had spent them consulting with their assistants, who had spent them desperately trying to find someone, anyone, who could explain how 53 children had suddenly become the most expensive hostages in galactic history. Your Magnificence, General Snootworth reported, his voice carrying the hollow tone of a man watching his career evaporate in real time. We've confirmed the presence of human military assets at all major Imperial installations. Our analysts estimate their combined firepower at approximately, he paused, double-checking numbers that seemed to mock the concept of rational military doctrine, 40 times our total defensive capability. Emperor Bloviatus blinked slowly, his magnificent brain struggling to process information that didn't fit his worldview. 40 times. That seems excessive for a primitive species. Yes, sir. Excessively excessive. Perhaps they're bluffing. It was at that moment that Captain Morrison's face appeared on every communication screen in the Imperial throne room, uninvited and completely bypassing what the Empire had considered to be impenetrable security systems. Good morning, Your Magnificence, Morrison said with the sort of polite smile that predators wear when discussing dinner plans. I'm Captain Morrison. You have something that belongs to us. The Emperor drew himself up to his full considerable height, preparing to deliver the sort of speech that had cowed lesser species for centuries. Human, you will address the Imperial throne with proper. I'm going to stop you right there, Morrison interrupted, his tone remaining conversational. We need to establish some ground rules for this conversation. First, you kidnapped 53 human children. Second, you classified this kidnapping as scientific specimen collection. Third, you now have approximately 6 hours to return those children safely, or things are going to get educational in ways your Imperial Zoo never imagined. You dare threaten the Galactic Empire? Bloviatus sputtered. We have maintained peace for 3,000 years through superior diplomatic. You've maintained peace, Morrison corrected, because nobody has been sufficiently motivated to explain to you why that peace existed in the first place. Consider this a learning opportunity. With that, the transmission cut off, leaving the Imperial throne room in the kind of silence usually reserved for funerals. General, the Emperor said slowly, perhaps we should reconsider our position on this matter. An excellent suggestion, Your Magnificence. Shall I contact the humans to arrange negotiations? Yes, immediately. Tell them we're prepared to discuss reasonable. General Snootworth's response was interrupted by the sound of every alarm in the Imperial capital beginning to wail simultaneously. Through the throne room's massive windows, they could see the sky filling with shapes that their eyes insisted couldn't possibly be there. Human warships were materializing directly above the Imperial capital, appearing out of what had seemed like empty space with the casual impossibility of stage magic. Not dozens of ships or even hundreds. Thousands of vessels, ranging from sleek destroyer-class craft to massive dreadnoughts that made Imperial battleships look like shuttlecraft. Sir, Admiral Flabengast's voice crackled through the emergency communication system. We're reading energy signatures that our sensors can't properly classify. These ships are using technologies that shouldn't exist. Elaborate, Snootworth demanded, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. They're running on what appears to be controlled antimatter reactions. Their hull materials are absorbing our targeting scanners, and their weapon systems are generating power readings that suggest they could crack planets. Emperor Bloviatus watched the impossible fleet hovering above his capital and experienced what historians would later describe as the first moment of genuine clarity in his reign. General, he said quietly, I believe we may have made an error in judgment. What happened next would be studied in military academies for centuries, assuming there were any military academies left to study it. The human fleet didn't attack the Imperial capital directly. Instead, they began what Captain Morrison would later describe as a practical demonstration of advanced military theory. The demonstration began with the simultaneous destruction of every Imperial military satellite in a dozen systems, accomplished with such precision that civilian communication networks remained completely unaffected. This was followed by the systematic disabling of Imperial naval vessels through what appeared to be targeted electromagnetic pulses that left the ships intact but completely powerless. "They're not trying to kill us," Admiral Flabbergast reported, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and terror. "They're proving they could kill us without breaking a sweat." The humans had turned warfare into performance art. Every Imperial fortress found its defensive systems mysteriously failing, not through brute force assault, but through what could only be described as technological surgery. Weapon systems simply stopped working. Shield generators powered down in perfect synchronization. Communications arrays began broadcasting human military communications instead of Imperial orders. "Sir," reported Colonel Bumbleton from the Tertius defense platform, "our main guns are operational, but they're only firing confetti. Multicolored confetti, with little notes attached." "What do the notes say?" Snootworth asked, though he dreaded the answer. "They say bang, you're dead. Love the humans." Meanwhile, Captain Morrison was conducting what amounted to a masterclass in applied psychology. Rather than destroying Imperial installations, his forces were systematically demonstrating their complete technological superiority, while going out of their way to avoid casualties. "Status report," Morrison requested from his command chair aboard the Righteous Indignation. "All Imperial military assets have been neutralized across 47 systems." Commander Santos reported, "0 casualties on either side. Their fleets are intact but completely disabled. We now have effective control of all major Imperial transportation routes, communication networks, and defensive installations." "Excellent. Any word from the Emperor?" "He's requesting immediate negotiations, sir. Something about reconsidering Imperial policy on educational specimen collection." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "Tell His Magnificence that we'll be happy to discuss terms once our children are safely home. Until then, we'll continue providing these helpful demonstrations of why kidnapping human children represents a fundamental misunderstanding of risk assessment." The most terrifying part, from the Empire's perspective, wasn't the overwhelming display of military superiority. It was the restraint. Humanity had just proven they could conquer the entire Galactic Empire before lunch, and instead they were politely waiting for an apology and the return of a school bus full of children. "They're not even breathing hard," General Snootworth observed as he watched human ships maintaining perfect formation above the Imperial capital. "This isn't their full capability. This is them being patient." Emperor Bloviatus, staring out at the impossible fleet that had appeared from nowhere to demonstrate the folly of Imperial arrogance, finally asked the question that should have been asked 3 days earlier. "General, what exactly did our intelligence reports say about human military capabilities?" Snootworth consulted his files with the expression of a man reading his own obituary. Quote, "Local defense forces adequate for regional peacekeeping. No significant threat to Imperial interests. Recommend continued minimal oversight." End quote. The Emperor nodded slowly. "I believe we may need to update those files." While Emperor Bloviatus was having his career-defining moment of clarity, Ambassador Quibbleton was experiencing what he would later describe as the most comprehensive failure of xenosociological analysis in recorded diplomatic history. Locked in his office with 17 different species worth of psychological profiles, cultural assessments, and behavioral prediction models, he was desperately trying to understand how an entire galaxy's worth of intelligence experts had gotten humanity so spectacularly wrong. "Computer," he said to his AI assistant, voice cracking slightly, "display all available data on human familial bonding patterns." Processing. Warning. Human familial data classified as incomplete due to insufficient observational priority. "Show me what we have." The holographic display flickered to life, showing a pathetically thin collection of reports. Most were footnotes in larger studies, casual observations from trade missions, and a few academic papers that nobody had bothered to read because humans were minimally relevant to Imperial interests. Subject: human reproductive and child-rearing behavior. Quibbleton read aloud from the most recent report. "Humans exhibit typical mammalian attachment to offspring. Recommend standard protocols for specimen collection. Note: humans may display mild distress when separated from young, similar to domesticated livestock. Duration of distress estimated at 2-3 standard weeks before acceptance of new circumstances." Quibbleton stared at the report, then looked out his window at the human dreadnought that was currently using the Imperial Senate building as a backdrop for what appeared to be weapons testing demonstrations. The mild distress was manifesting as the most overwhelming display of military force in galactic history. Computer, cross-reference human military response with documented cases of species defending offspring. Processing, warning, no comparable cases found in galactic database. Human response magnitude exceeds all previous records by factor of approximately, does not compute. Meanwhile, in the depths of the Imperial Research Facility where 53 human children were being held for educational purposes, Dr. Quentin Flibbernaut was making discoveries that were rapidly rewriting xenobiology textbooks. The children had been remarkably well behaved for the first 2 days, curious about their surroundings, polite to their captors, and seemingly adapting well to their new environment. Then the human fleet had arrived. Dr. Flibbernaut, his research assistant, reported nervously. The subjects are exhibiting unusual behavior patterns. The good doctor adjusted his spectacles and peered through the observation window at what had been designed as a comfortable habitat for primitive specimens. The children were gathered in the center of the room, and they were organizing. 10-year-old Tommy Henderson had apparently appointed himself as group leader, and was conducting what appeared to be a strategic planning session. 8-year-old Sally Martinez was demonstrating the layout of the facility using building blocks from their play area. The older children were teaching the younger ones what looked suspiciously like basic military hand signals. Fascinating, Dr. Flibbernaut murmured. Computer, are you recording this behavior? Recording confirmed. Note, subjects appear to be exhibiting advanced cooperative planning behaviors typically associated with adult military personnel. That's impossible. They're children. They are human children, his assistant corrected quietly. As if to emphasize the point, little Amy Chen H7H said somehow fashioned what appeared to be a functional communication device out of toys, food packaging, and what looked like components from the room's environmental systems. Dr. Flibbernaut, she called out sweetly. Could you come here please? We'd like to talk to you. The doctor approached the habitat cautiously. The children had arranged themselves in a neat semicircle, with Tommy Henderson standing at the front like a tiny general addressing his troops. Yes, children, we know our parents are coming, Tommy said with the sort of calm certainty that was deeply unsettling coming from a 4th grader. We can hear the grown-ups outside getting scared. We wanted to let you know that if you're nice to us and don't hurt anybody, we'll tell our moms and dads to be nice to you too. Dr. Flibbernaut blinked. That's very thoughtful of you. But if you're mean to us, added Sally Martinez, or if you hurt any of the people who work here, our parents are going to be very, very upset. And when human parents get upset about their children, concluded Amy Chen, holding up her improvised communication device, they tend to break things. We've been listening to the radio chatter. They've broken a lot of things already. Back in the Imperial throne room, General Snootworth was receiving reports that painted an increasingly surreal picture of humanity's response to the crisis. It wasn't just the overwhelming military display, it was the precision of it, the restraint, and the utterly alien psychology driving it. Sir, reported Lieutenant Wobblethwaite from Imperial Intelligence, we've been monitoring human communications, and we're detecting some unusual patterns. Elaborate. They're not communicating like a military organization, sir. They're communicating like angry parents. Explain. Every human ship, base and installation is receiving constant updates about the children's welfare. Not strategic updates, personal updates. Things like Tommy's favorite food is pizza, and Sally gets scared in the dark. Make sure there's a nightlight, and Amy has a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Floppington that she can't sleep without. General Snootworth felt something cold settle in his stomach. They're treating this as a rescue operation. Yes, sir, but here's the disturbing part. They're doing it with the most advanced military coordination we've ever observed. They've turned parental concern into a science. Ambassador Quibbleton, monitoring the same communications, was coming to a realization that would fundamentally change the galaxy's understanding of human psychology. He'd spent decades studying species that formed loose family groups, or pack bonds, or hive mind connections. But humans had created something entirely different. They had weaponized love. Computer, display comparative analysis of species response to offspring threat. The holographic display showed dozens of examples from across the galaxy. The Zentorian pack response, increased aggression, decreased tactical thinking. The Vorlon hive response, sacrifice of individuals for species survival. The Cricket territorial response, defensive posturing until threat passes. The human response was unlike anything in the galactic database. They had become more tactical, more coordinated, more dangerous, not less. The threat to their children hadn't triggered blind rage or desperate defense. It had triggered the kind of cold, calculated fury that builds starships in secret and plans military campaigns across multiple star systems, while making sure there are enough nightlights for scared 7-year-olds. "Sir," his assistant reported, "we're receiving a new transmission from Captain Morrison." Morrison's face appeared on the screen, and Quibbleton noticed that the human looked tired. Not physically exhausted, emotionally drained, like a parent who'd been up all night with a sick child. "Ambassador Quibbleton," Morrison said quietly, "I understand you're the Empire's expert on human affairs." Yes, Captain, though I fear my expertise has proven somewhat inadequate." "That's not your fault. We've spent a lot of effort making sure nobody understood what we were capable of, because we hoped we'd never need to demonstrate it." Morrison's expression hardened slightly. "But you took our children, and that changed everything." "Captain, I want you to understand that the Empire meant no harm." "Ambassador, let me explain something about human psychology that apparently didn't make it into your files. We don't just love our children. We define ourselves by our willingness to protect them. Every human parent makes the same promise to their child: nothing will hurt you while I'm alive. We don't make that promise lightly." Morrison leaned forward, and his voice took on the quality of absolute certainty. 53 human parents made that promise to 53 human children. You made us break that promise. Now we have to fix it, and we will move stars and shatter worlds to keep our word. Not because we're violent, because we're parents. The transmission ended, leaving Ambassador Quibbleton staring at a blank screen, and finally understanding the magnitude of the Empire's mistake. They hadn't just kidnapped children from a primitive species. They had threatened the young of the most protective parents in the galaxy, and those parents had battleships. The resolution of what historians would call the shortest war in galactic history began with Emperor Bloviatus doing something unprecedented in his reign. He made a sensible decision. "General Snootworth," he announced, his voice carrying the hollow tone of a man whose worldview had been systematically demolished by reality, "prepare the Imperial transport immediately. We're returning the children personally." "Sire?" The general wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. "I said we're returning them. All of them. Immediately. With apologies. And gifts. Very expensive gifts." The Emperor gestured toward the window, where human warships continued their patient hovering above the capital. "I have a feeling that keeping those children any longer would be inadvisable for the continued existence of Imperial civilization." "What about the specimen collection program?" "General, I'm about to cancel the specimen collection program so hard that the Empire will pretend it never existed. In fact, I'm considering pretending I never existed." Within 2 hours, the Imperial transport Apologetic Contrition was en route to New Brooklyn, carrying 53 very excited human children, a medical team to verify their health, enough candy to supply a small planet, and Emperor Bloviatus himself, who had decided that this particular diplomatic crisis required the personal touch. Dr. Flibbernaut had spent the journey conducting what he called exit interviews with his former subjects, partly for scientific curiosity, and partly because the children seemed eager to explain exactly why their rescue had been inevitable. "You see," 10-year-old Tommy Henderson explained patiently, "human grown-ups are really good at finding things. And when the thing they're looking for is their kids, they get really, really good at it." "But how did your parents know where to find you so quickly?" the doctor asked. 8-year-old Sally Martinez held up a small device that looked like a toy but was clearly much more sophisticated. "Emergency tracker. All human kids have them. They're built into our shoes, our clothes, our backpacks, even our lunchboxes. Our parents always know where we are. Always, always," confirmed 7-year-old Amy Chen. "Human parents are like that. They worry a lot, so they prepare for everything. Even for aliens kidnapping us for science projects." Dr. Flibbernaut made a note in his journal. Human child rearing practices include comprehensive emergency preparedness protocols. Previous assessment of overprotective parenting may require significant revision. Meanwhile, aboard the HMS Righteous Indignation, Captain Morrison was conducting what amounted to the most polite military occupation in galactic history. His forces had positioned themselves at every major Imperial installation, not as conquerors, but as extremely well-armed babysitters, making sure nothing else went wrong. "Status report," Morrison requested, though his attention was focused on the tactical display showing the Imperial transport's progress toward New Brooklyn. "All children confirmed safe and healthy, sir," Commander Santos reported. Imperial medical teams report no injuries, adequate nutrition, and surprisingly good morale. Apparently they spent most of their captivity organizing escape plans and teaching each other advanced mathematics. Of course they did. Morrison smiled, with the sort of parental pride that somehow made his battleship more intimidating, not less. Human children are remarkably resourceful when properly motivated. Sir, we're also receiving diplomatic communications from across the galaxy. It appears word of our demonstration has spread. Morrison raised an eyebrow. What kind of communications? Mostly variations on please don't hurt us, and we have always respected human territorial sovereignty, sir. Also several requests for formal alliance treaties, and what appears to be a marriage proposal from the Duchess of Rigel. Note to Diplomatic Corps, we're accepting the apologies and alliance requests. Politely decline the marriage proposal. The moment everyone had been waiting for came when the Imperial transport touched down at New Brooklyn Primary School, where 53 sets of human parents were waiting with the sort of controlled patience that had been intimidating Imperial forces across 47 star systems. Emperor Bloviatus emerged from his transport wearing his most apologetic ceremonial robes and carrying what appeared to be a prepared speech. He took one look at the assembled parents, mothers and fathers who had spent the last week wondering if they'd ever see their children again, and promptly threw the speech away. I am deeply, profoundly sorry, he said simply. We made a terrible mistake, and your children paid the price for our ignorance. There is no excuse for what we did, and no apology sufficient for the pain we caused. The parents watched him in silence, the kind of quiet that had been making Imperial officials nervous all week. Then the transport doors opened, and 53 children came running out to 53 emotional reunions that would be talked about for generations. Tommy Henderson launched himself into his mother's arms. Sally Martinez disappeared into a group hug with her entire extended family. Amy Chen clutched her stuffed rabbit Mr. Floppington, while her parents cried and refused to let her go. And Emperor Bloviatus, watching these reunions, finally understood what Captain Morrison had tried to explain about human parental psychology. These weren't just family units or reproductive partnerships. These were bonds so fundamental to human psychology that threatening them had triggered a species-wide response that redefined galactic power structures. Your Magnificence, approached Captain Morrison, having materialized with the sort of quiet efficiency that human military personnel seemed to specialize in. Captain Morrison, the Emperor replied, I want you to know that the Empire will be making significant changes to our policies regarding human affairs. What kind of changes? All of them, Bloviatus said firmly. Starting with a formal recognition of human territorial sovereignty, continuing with a complete overhaul of our intelligence services, and ending with my personal guarantee that nothing like this will ever happen again. Morrison nodded approvingly. That's a good start. What about reparations? Name your terms. Educational scholarships for all 53 children, full medical monitoring until they reach adulthood, and a formal apology to be broadcast across the galaxy, explaining exactly why kidnapping human children was the worst diplomatic decision in recorded history. Agreed. Oh, and one more thing, Morrison added casually. The human fleet will be maintaining a permanent presence in Imperial space. For everyone's protection, you understand. Emperor Bloviatus looked up at the sky, where human warships were still visible as distant stars that moved in perfect formation. I understand completely, and so ended the war that lasted 6 days and redefined galactic civilization. The official records would show minimal casualties, mostly Imperial pride and several outdated intelligence assessments. The unofficial records would note that humanity had introduced an entirely new concept to galactic diplomacy, the idea that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. Ambassador Quibbleton, tasked with updating the Empire's files on human affairs, submitted his final report 3 months later. It was considerably longer than his previous assessments. Species, Homo sapiens, he wrote. Classification do not antagonize under any circumstances. Military capability, substantially beyond previous estimates. Recommend immediate upgrade to galactic superpower status. Cultural notes, humans exhibit unprecedented protective behaviors toward offspring. Any threat to human children should be considered an existential threat to whoever makes it. Diplomatic recommendation, maintain friendly relations through chocolate, coffee, and never ever taking their kids. The report was immediately classified at the highest levels and distributed to every diplomatic mission in the galaxy. Captain Morrison, for his part, returned to his fishing on Terra Nova, secure in the knowledge that 53 children were safely home with their families. His fleet remained in imperial space, a gentle reminder that humanity's definition of neighborhood watch included interstellar peacekeeping. And across the galaxy, species that had never heard of humans suddenly became very interested in maintaining friendly relations with the people who had ended 3,000 years of peace in order to get their children back. Because as it turned out, there was something more powerful than diplomatic tradition, military might, or imperial authority. There was a human parent who'd made a promise to keep their child safe. And humans, as the galaxy had learned, always kept their promises.